Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from near and far. I'm Hamutal Gouri. I'm a cultural critic, a group facilitator, and a storyteller for social change. And I am really honored to be speaking to you this evening about archiving, remembering, and transforming through storytelling. So we will begin. I'm soon going to share a screen. So in addition to seeing my face, you'll be seeing some interesting images. Oh, it's good to see everybody. Hi. Okay. So we need words to remember. We need archives to preserve memories for generations to come. And we need stories to transform our memories and write the next chapters of our lives. My father, of blessed memory, the poet and writer Hamutal Gouri, wrote all of his books of poetry, fiction, articles, and investigative journalism in his small study at our third-floor apartment in Jerusalem. As a child, I remember the bottles of dark blue ink that he used to refill his fountain pen. Sometimes he would get dark blue ink stains on the tips of his fingers. As I grew up, he switched to a typewriter. Remember those things, typewriters? He started typing with 2 fingers, first slowly, then fiercely. And I could hear the sound of the clicking of the typewriter's keys day and night. And as I was writing, I was preparing for this presentation, I remembered this beautiful musical piece by Leroy Anderson, the Typewriter Song, which I want to share with you now.
I'm sorry, after you share, just enlarge the presentation.
Okay, will do. Okay, okay, I want to share with you Leroy Anderson's piece. Maybe we'll come back to it later. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but if you recall, it's a beautiful musical piece for an orchestra and a typewriter. And I was thinking that younger children and future generations may not recall what the sound of a typewriter is, or that gentle ring at the end of a line, you know, as the machine hits the end of the line and you go on to the next line. When my father was 70, we bought him his first computer. So no more dark blue ink stains and no more clicking on the typewriter's keyboards. But new sounds emerged. I would be at work at the office and I would get a call from my father and he would say, a terrible thing just happened. He, meaning the computer, just sent me a message telling me I made a fatal error. Now, I imagine that the programmers of the DOS operating system or the Windows operating system were maybe not aware of the fact that for storytellers, a fatal error is that error of colossal magnitude that propels a series of tragic events, okay? Think of King Lear, think of Antigona, think of King Oedipus, okay? These are colossal human errors out of vanity, out of greed, out of the search of endless power that propel a tragedy that ends with destruction. So they were not aware of it. And I had to keep explaining to my father that he, meaning the computer, was not wiser or smarter than he is. and that fatal error in some cases means something completely different.
תרצי שאני אשתף?
סליחה?
תרצי שאני אשתף את היצירה?
כן, בבקשה. Yes, thank you. Okay, so Doron, wonderful Doron, is going to help us, and he's going to share the beautiful musical piece, the typewriter song. Thank you so much, Doron. So for people of my generation and older generation, we all remember the piece and we remember the sound of the typewriter. And so this musical piece, which is now available on YouTube, is a way of preserving a memory of a sound that has actually disappeared from our daily lives. So, but between ink bottles, typewriters, computers, the one thing that remained steady in my father's study were the piles of papers and cardboard dossiers on his desk, on the bookshelves, and in the closet turned archive in my mother's study. My father always said to us, his three daughters, that he had no fortune to bequeath to us, but he will leave us this inheritance: the trials and tribulations of the people of Israel, Hatzarot shel Am Yisrael for the Hebrew speakers, in the sense of caring deeply for this land of Israel and all of its inhabitants, and the terrible mess in his drawers. And he kept good on both promises. We, his offspring, continue as educators, activists, and scholars to care deeply about pretty much everything. And as for the mess in the drawers, well, we, his family, share it with the National Library of Israel. On his 85th birthday, my father donated his archive to the National Library of Israel. It includes handwritten correspondence with fellow writers, political leaders, public figures, and readers, and unique manuscripts, including poems that were not published in any of his collections of poetry or any books of poetry that were published. One such poem is a poem in memory of Gideon Pelly, known as Johnny to his friends, who died in the War of Independence in 1948. It was one of my father's earlier poems, and it was published at the time in the newsletter of Kibbutz Kiryat Anavim near Jerusalem in a very limited edition. Johnny was born and lived in Kiryat, in that kibbutz. In 2019, about a year and a half ago, Yosef Uziel, a bereaved father who lost his son Gabriel in a military action in 2003, brought a copy of the poem printed in the newsletter to Yaron Sachish, the National Library of Israel staff member in charge of managing my father's archive. Yaron found the handwritten poem and I want to show it to you. So I'm going to go back to sharing my presentation. Okay. Okay, we're going to go back to this. This is the poem. As you can see, it's a draft with, this is how my father used to write, erasing and rewriting, and it is dedicated to Johnny. So Yaron found the handwritten poem in the very last file of documents that my parents, my father and my mother, handed to the National Library of Israel. And earlier this year, just before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, my mother read the poem in a memorial ceremony held for Johnny, in Johnny's memory, at the military cemetery of the kibbutz. This story is a vivid example of the importance of archiving as an act of preserving accounts, texts, creation, memories of events from our recent and ancient past and history. So we need words to remember. And we need access to words and images that help preserve the memories. My father was a remembering man. He was constantly preoccupied with rifts and interruptions in the associative continuum. He believed we all had an imperative to know and preserve history and learn from it, to remember where we came from. Zechor me'ayin bata, as Rabbi Akavya ben Mahalalel said. And I want to go back now, with your permission, to remember that TV series? Use your thumbnail or whatever to say if you recall this wonderful TV series called The Storyteller, with John Hart as the storyteller and a puppet of a dog who was actually, thank you, Sally. Okay, but what I usually like to do when I'm doing these online or offline storytelling sessions is to ask people to use the chat box to just name one of their favorite stories. And by story, I mean a film, a book, a play, a children's book, a TV show, or a real life story. So feel free to use the chat box to write one of your favorite stories. And Dawn is going to share some of your references with me. So we need words to remember, but we need stories to heal. Meaning that sometimes we're haunted by our memories, or sometimes our actions in the present and towards the future are informed by memories and narratives that either haunt us or that became sort of the mainstream interpretation of the collective memory. And soon I'm going to ask a dear friend, Rabbah Ellen Flack, to read a poem by my father called His Mother. And this is a poem about the mother of Sisera. If you remember, if you recall, I'll refresh your memory. Sisera was the military leader who fought against Barak and Deborah. He fought for King Yavin of Chatzor, okay? He lost the battle and he ended up being killed by Yael, Eshet Hever HaKeni. It is unclear whether she was the wife of Hever HaKeni or a member of the tribe called Hever HaKeni. But she is remembered in Jewish history as one of our heroines because she gave him milk, which made him sleepy, and then she killed him with a peg, with a tent peg. Ellen, are you ready to now read His Mother? And I'm going to
Yeah,
also
yeah.
share.
Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted?
You are.
Okay. Give me a second here. His mother. It was years ago, at the end of Deborah's song, I heard the silence of Sisera's chariot so long in coming. I watched Sisera's mother captured in the window, a woman with a silver streak in her hair. A spoil of multi-hued embroideries, 2 for the throat of each despoiler. This is what the maiden saw. That very hour he lay in the tent as one asleep, his hands quite empty. On his chin traces of milk, butter, blood. The silence was not broken by the horses and chariots. The maidens, too, fell silent one by one. My silence reached out to theirs. After a while, sunset. After a while, the afterglow is gone. 40 years the land knew peace. 40 years no horses galloped, no dead horsemen stared glassily. But her death came soon after her son's.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So it is one of my, I don't know, 200, 300, 400 most favorite poems by my father. But the reason I choose it very often, and the reason I chose to share it this evening or this afternoon, is because I think that this is a vivid example of compassion, of deep compassion in its deepest sense of the word. My own initiation to storytelling, for social transformation, for personal transformation, for healing, started more than 30 years ago. When I came across this proverb, it was hanging on the wall as a poster at the place where I ended up working for more than 20 years. It was a technical assistance and capacity building organization for social change groups. And the poster said, "Until lions have their historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." So if you recall, those of you who recall pieces from Shirat Voa, it is all about we won and they lost. But it was there that my commitment to telling the untold stories of unsung heroes was first sparked. I find that storytelling, which is as old as humankind, is a most generous and compassionate form of art and communications. When we share stories, when we listen to other people's stories, we are performing an act of great kindness. As the folktale I'm about to share with you shows. And spoiler, Norman Perrin here, my dear colleague from Toronto, is going to share another story about the power of storytelling later on. So here's the story. I found it in a wonderful book called From the Beast to the Blonde by Maria Warner. While a poor man's wife in the village thrives, the sultana in the palace grows thinner and scrappier by the minute. The sultan summons a poor man and demands to know the secret of his wife's happiness. "Very simple," he replies. "I feed her meat of the tongue. The sultan sends out for all the tongues money can buy, ox tongues and lamb's tongues and lark's tongues. Still, his sad sultana withers away. He orders his litter, makes her change places with the poor man's wife. She immediately starts to thrive, becoming the picture of health, plumper, rosier, gayer. Meanwhile, in the palace, her replacement languishes, and soon has become as scrawny and miserable as the former queen. For the tongue meats that the poor man feeds the women are not material, of course. They are fairy tales, stories, jokes. He nourishes them on talk. He wraps them in language. He banishes melancholy by refusing silence. Now, I think this is one of the most sensuous descriptions of storytelling and telling stories and sharing stories. But this is so true because transformation, change can happen when we disturb the silence, when we break the silence. So this story, much like the proverb about the lions and their historians, both constitute formative moments in my life as a scholar and as an activist. My first research into storytelling, primarily ancient folk and fairy tales, focused on their potential healing power for women and children survivors of sexual abuse. I was drawn to and intrigued by the initiatory qualities of those ancient folk tales. Unlike the written versions collected by the Grimm brothers in Germany and Charles Perrault in France, intended to educate bourgeois girls and boys on proper behavior and the perils of curiosity and disobedience, the oral folk tales emphasized qualities such as resilience, resourcefulness, loyalty, and solidarity. And if we have time, I'll give you a very small example. Are you all familiar with the story of Little Red Riding Hood? Yes, you are. And how does it end? The wolf comes in, he swallows the grandmother, he swallows Little Red Riding Hood, and then the brave hunter comes and he kills the wolves and he opens his belly and he rescues grandma and Little Red Riding Hood, and then he fills the wolf's belly with stones and throws him in the river, and of course, the wolf dies. But there is a wonderful early version, oral version of this story where there's no hunter, and the wolf does not devour grandma nor Little Red Riding Hood. What they do is they alone, the two women, the grandma and the granddaughter, they trick the wolf. They pour the water in which they cook the beef for the stew down the pipe and into the creek. And the wolf, smelling the smell of meat, follows the smell and drowns in the river, which is a more humane death than having your belly filled with. But he gets to die, because this is one of the wonderful things about folk and fairy tales. The bad loses, the good wins. Okay, happy ending. Okay, so I want to take a look for a minute at your favorite stories. And I will do that while still looking at.
Hi, so Ellen said To Kill a Mockingbird. Francine wrote Princess Bride. Tracy wrote Yentl. Jody, The Giving Tree. I'm not going to read any more names. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, Star Trek, How Green Was My Valley, book and film. Gone with the Wind, the book. Invisible Cities, the Jungle Books. La Belle, oh, I can't read that. French. I don't want to even try, sorry. Mouse, okay. Man, The Little Prince. My favorite was the Narnia Chronicles, all 7 of them. All the Golden Books, The Children of Lear, Island of Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, The Red Tent, 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff, Out of Africa, The Life of Pi, Alice in Wonderland, Homer, Ilias and Odyssey, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, A Boy and a Pigeon, My Grandmother's Magic Stories, Jack and the Beanstalk, The Sleeping Beauty, Richard from South Africa. Thank you. The Necklace Guy, another French word, de Maupassant, something like that. All the Beatrix Potter stories, Make Way for Ducklings, Race, Class, and Gender.
Oh!
So
wow.
many books out there. I can read over and over again. 84. The Lost by Daniel Mendelsohn. The Day Lasts more than 100 years. More than 100 years. and more and more and more. It goes on.
Okay, all wonderful, wonderful, wonderful stories. So we're going to talk a little about how we tell stories or how stories are told. But for a minute, let's dwell on why we tell stories. So we tell stories, and this is a great quote from Jonah Sachs, who says, stories are how we humans arrange and recount our experiences of the world so that others will want to listen and to learn from them. So storytelling is a great sense-making tool, okay? Because when we tell stories and we use images and we use imagination, we're helping ourselves and others make sense of our experiences. So let's talk a little about how we tell stories. Why can I not?
ננסה להעביר קדימה?
Yes.
חץ.
Yes, that's what I'm doing, but for some reason.
תפסיקי את השיתוף ותעלי אותו שוב.
Okay, so I'm going to stop share and I'm going to load it again. Hi, everyone. Now I get to see you. No, that's not what I want. Okay. Can you see my screen now?
כן.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, so let's talk a little about.
תגדילי.
Yes, let's talk about how we tell stories. Okay, so this is, so the illustration is by my son Daniel, and this is his interpretation of a folktale about Hilka. Hilka was one of the leaders of a village, an all-female village. This is an all-women village community, and they lived by a lake. But they couldn't go into the water because the bed of the lake bed was filled with horrible monsters. And every time one of the girls or the women of the community went into the lake, she never came back because the monsters devoured her. And everything that they tried didn't help. So what Hilka did is she collected these sweet-smelling flowers. And then she threw them on the surface of the water of the lake. And that's when all the monsters emerged from the bed of the river to the surface of the river. And then she bit the crap out of them, pardon my French, and destroyed all the monsters. And the women of the community of the village could safely immerse in the water. And the beauty of this story, except for the fact that I personally love stories with female powerful protagonists, there aren't enough of them. I mean, there are many of them, but they're not as often told, is because the metaphor here is that sometimes in order to overcome the monster, we first have to reveal its true face. Okay, so how we tell stories. So Christopher Booker, who's a folklorist who researched thousands and thousands of stories and texts, basically says that any story ever told that is being told now and will be told in the future falls into at least one, and possibly more, like Princess Bride is all of them, 7 basic plot lines, okay? And they are overcoming the monster, rags to riches, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and rebirth. Okay? So overcoming the monster, let's go to Princess Bride. You know, we have evil prince, and we have like mini villains and mega villains, but Overcoming the monster is all about vanquishing the forces that disempower us within and without, overcoming challenges, removing obstacles, and of course, good versus evil. So the elimination of everything that is bad about humanity. The monsters, if you think about everything from science fiction to very often, the monsters are either physically deformed, not always, sometimes they're very handsome, but they represent everything that is evil and corrupt in human nature, okay? The second one is rags to riches, okay? Cinderella, okay? Jack and the Beanstalk. There are so many stories because so many of the stories that people tell are about achieving fame or achieving fortune, okay? But it's not only about rags to riches. It is also about from marginalization to power, overcoming prejudice, class, ethnicity, gender. For example, I found out about Christopher Booker's book through a wonderful article by a storyteller and journalist who actually was referring to the fact that when Barack Obama won the presidential elections in 2008 and became president in 2009, the press referred to his story as a Cinderella story, not because he was poor when he was elected, but because he was Black, okay? And of course, to go back to the bourgeois ethics of folk and fairy tales, it's about hard work that pays off. The quest is about exploration. It is about search. It is also about reflection, gaining insights and wisdom, and seeking answers. Okay, so the quest could be, you know, the story, we know the story about the child who's out there looking for a remedy for his mother's illness, but it could also be the internal journey, you know, like The Alchemist, yes, by Paulo Coelho, or other stories that are about seeking the meaning of life, as Monty Python called it. Voyage and Return is also a story of a quest, but there is an emphasis here on being lost and being found, and finally reaching your destination. It is the story, if you like, of the Odyssey. And to go back to how important memory is. So Odysseus, you know, he has to overcome so many monsters and resist so many temptations. And sometimes he does not resist temptation and he's held back. And he's able to finally come home to Ithaca when he's actually in a nearby island and he's having a conversation with one of the locals. And he tells him what it is that he misses about home. He remembers who he wants to go home to and why he wants to go home. So it is about journey, it is about memory, it is about continuity, and about finding one's place. Comedy is, of course, humor. It is a great way of emphasizing absurd reality. A story told by a fool, a clown, a jester. You know, if you recall, the clown or the jester or the court jester or the fool, in both, I'll come to tragedy in a minute, they have the license to speak truth to power because they are seemingly half-wits, okay? So they can say, if you remember in Twelfth Night, I think it is it in Twelfth Night? When the fool basically tell the Duke, you know, are you really in love with that woman, or it's just about having what you can't have? Okay, no one dares say anything to him except the fool. And it is often a way to apply a light tone to a heavy topic. And that's why very often comedy actually is very provocative. Okay? And finally, tragedy. So to go back to the fatal error, okay? Tragedy is about fatal errors and deadly sins like wrath and greed and sloth and pride and lust and envy and gluttony. These are errors committed by humans, and they cannot be avoided, okay? In Oedipus, for example, they're a result of blindness or unconsciousness or these 7 deadly sins in Christianity. But it is, how many of you recall a film called Educating Rita? Okay. So in Educating Rita, this is about an alcoholic, embittered professor of literature who's teaching Rita. She's from South London, and she's, I think, a hairdresser. And he's trying to explain to her what a tragedy is. And she says in her thick South London accent that tragedy is poor John being run by a truck. And he says, that's not a tragedy. And she answers, well, it's a bloody tragedy for the poor sod. But what he is trying to explain to her, that what is tragic about tragedy is that the fatal error that propels the tragic event cannot be avoided until it's too late. And so at the end of the tragedy, there is no happy ending. There is no resolution. Not all is well in the world. As a matter of fact, nothing is quite well in the world, but there is the possibility of an insight, right? A minute when we realize that we can learn from these fatal mistakes and do better. I don't want to be too political, but if we're looking at the state of the world today, I don't know if we're learning from our mistakes or not. Okay. I think I'm going to pause here, Dawn, and see if we have any questions. And we'll take a few questions, and then I'll ask my dear colleague Norman to tell us another story. But let's see if we have any questions.
We do. Sandy would like to hear the quote again, the one you started by "Until lions have their something."
Until lions have their historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Like so many proverbs that of unknown origin, it is usually quoted as an African proverb. But it is, I think, a more poetic and more profound interpretation of what we know is that history is written by the winners. Because what this proverb actually says is, no, history is written by everybody if they have someone to tell their story.
Thank you. Bilha wanted to know what the name of the story with Hilka is.
I think it's called Hilka. I can send you, Dawn. It's from a collection of folk and fairy tales that are all about female protagonists. So I'm assuming if you Google Hilka, you may find it, but I'm happy to send you the information, Dawn.
Thank you. Carol wrote a very, very wonderful compliment to you about how she is inspired by you to write, to help her write the story of her family from Germany in 1933. I'll definitely send you the transcript of the chat room so you can see the rest of the compliments. It's just mostly compliments, and I'll let you know later on.
Okay with compliments, but I love questions. Okay, so if while we're waiting for more questions.
I'm sorry, there is one more, I'm sorry. Could you please speak more about the relationship between word and role of the stories transforming memories?
Okay, so I actually have an exercise. I'm not sure I have it in English, but I can, and I'm happy to send it to you, Dawn. I'm doing this exercise that's called From Memory to Story. And I'm going to share something that is personal, because I mentioned that my first research into folk and fairy tales and their healing power was about women and children survivors of sexual abuse and abuse. And if you think about it, so many folk and fairy tales are about incest, okay? All the variants of Cinderella, the not so nice ones, like donkey skin and bear skin, and so many of the folk and fairy tales that we know, including Hansel and Gretel, are about adults doing terrible things to children. And of course, all the variants of Bluebeard, you know, the very violent husband. So this was my first research, and it brought together my passion for storytelling and my feminist scholarship. And the interesting, and so I think that the key to transforming a memory, especially painful memories, to a story, to a transformative story, is in that distinction that I made between initiatory and cautionary tales, okay? So the moralité at the end of Little Red Riding Hood, for example, was little girls should know that they should not be curious and they should never disobey their mother. And if they do, then they deserve to be devoured or to be victims of violence. Whereas the message of initiatory tales is, yes, something really bad happened to you, and it shouldn't have happened to you, and it is not your fault, but you have the power, the resilience, the resourcefulness, and the community that surrounds you to overcome. It doesn't mean you'll forget. Memories don't go away, but they don't have to constantly inform our actions. So one key for moving from memory, especially repetitive memory, to story is to find that in us, that beautiful rebel in us, okay, that says, I have the resilience and I have the resourcefulness. The other piece, and I want to go back to that. So all the illustrations here are by my son. This illustration is called The Storyteller, and storytelling is all about creating community, loving community, caring community. So if we go back to the story about the Sultan, rapping with language, healing with language, breaking the silence, disturbing the silence is another really important component. And I think if you are at a point where you want to start writing a new story or a story or the story of your family, I find that either using the memory from story, and I'm happy to share with you the exercise that I developed, but also using the seven basic plots is really a great way to go about it. Because you may find that overcoming the monster works beautifully for you. Or maybe it's a story of a quest. But what is so beautiful about the seven basic plots is that once we decide that our story is primarily a story of a quest, of a search, or of a journey, then we know, you all shared your favorite stories. We know how these plot lines work. We know what happens first and then what happens next and how it evolves. Dawn?
Yes?
Do we have more questions, or can I invite Norman to tell a story about the power of stories, and then we can take additional questions.
Shane or Shana asks, can you please discuss how oral stories represent or work in cultural contexts as vehicles of collective memory?
Wow. Okay. Can you repeat the question? Sorry. That's a great question, but can you please repeat it?
Absolutely. Can you discuss how oral stories represent or work in cultural contexts as vehicles of collective memory?
That is a wonderful question. So I want to first go back to ancient times and then I want to go to more recent time, okay? So I mentioned cautionary tales and initiatory tales, and my research found that very often the tales that were of initiatory, or the variants or the versions of stories that were of initiatory nature, were told by women to women, or by older women to younger women, okay? They were initiating them into adulthood in many cases, and they were preparing them for what being an adult woman or being a married woman entails. And so, and these stories were told very often when the women were sitting together performing a very Sisyphic or very tedious labor, such as weaving or etc. And the storytelling and the story sharing was partly entertainment, so to just pass the time, but also to share wisdom, to share knowledge. And this is how we now, from hundreds of years later, actually can learn about the lives of women, of children, of boys and girls, of poverty, of hunger, or of animals, surrounding the towns and villages through these stories, okay? We know something about the experiences of these people. And we know what growing into or becoming an adult for both girls and boys meant sometimes in these really hard times, okay? But this was a way of sort of shaping not only collective memory, but collective knowledge. But if we now think of more recently, even think about, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but think about the COVID-19 crisis, okay? And what happened when it first erupted. And there were so many narratives, including conflicting narratives, okay? And so much fake news, and so much, it's in Israel, there was a doctor who said COVID-19, Corona is an influenza with good PR. Okay, it's all public relations. Whereas on the other hand, there were all these scenarios of millions and millions of people dying, etc. Now, it is important for me to say storytelling is not fake news. It's fake, it's facts, okay? It is just a way of conveying facts not only about current affairs, but it's mostly, Jack Zipes, who's a wonderful folklore scholar, says that folk and fairy tales continue to thrive and be such a central part of our culture because they're about the human DNA. They're about who we are, okay? They're about love and passion and lust and envy and good and bad and our dreams and our hopes and our aspirations and the challenges and so every generation and every culture produces its stories. And to go back to remembering and to archiving and to that handwritten poem by my father, preserving the oral tales and preserving that knowledge and transforming that knowledge from one generation onto another, I think attests to how central stories and narratives are to us as human beings and as a society.
Thank you. Shelley and a few more other people are asking to repeat the 7 types of stories, if you can.
Okay, I'm gonna, let's do that. Oh, no, it's actually the other way. Okay, Overcoming the Monster, Rags to Riches, The Quest, Voyage and Return, Comedy, Tragedy, and Rebirth. I actually did not touch on Rebirth. Okay, so rebirth are stories of transformation. They could be transformation from victimhood to agency, from fear to courage, from devastation to hope. But also, you know, they could be stories of near death experiences and coming back to life. But it's a story of of profound transformation.
Thank you. Tally and a few more people are asking to please share your exercise.
Aha. You know what? So while I search for it.
Okay, so there's another question.
Sure. Sorry.
There's another question.
Okay.
Can you speak to what prevents an individual from crafting his or her story and moving towards healing? What prevents an individual from writing the story?
Okay, so I'm going to respond to this question as a storyteller and a social change activist. I'm not a therapist, so this is not in any way a clinically approved response. But as a storyteller, I say that as long as we are caught up in the story someone else tells us about us, we cannot, it's challenging, it's more difficult for us to telling our own story. Okay, the disability rights movement coined this term, nothing about us without us. So in order to transform ourselves and our lives with story, we need what is referred to in my professional line of work, agency, which is the ability to act, okay? Agency. And so very often what happens, and this happens to us in our very intimate personal lives, and it happens to us more broadly. I can say as a feminist that I'm always aware of how women are described by, well, some men, okay? Or if we go to current events in the United States, how white people describe people of color. And so as long as we are caught up in a story, in someone else's story about us, our agency is limited. And so as a storyteller, I always say we're wasting our energy if we are in a reactive mode where we're saying, I am not this and this, or this is not true about me. So rather than being caught up in someone else's story about us, it's let me tell you who I am. Let me tell you what my life was. Let me tell you what my dreams are. Okay? I'm going to look for the memory to story exercise. And if I don't find the English version, I'm just going to translate the Hebrew one. But while I do this, Dawn, I'm going to ask Norman to please tell us a story about the power of stories. And I'm sure that Norman's story will answer questions that we haven't asked yet. You just need to unmute yourself, Norman.
Oh, it's a tall order there. Okay, I'm telling the story from the Four Winds Library. You can't see anything behind me, but I'm looking at about 6,000 books of folktales from around the world. And that's how we record stories. Sometimes we embed stories in landscapes. That hill, that's where Uncle Fred slid down, and the things he said as he came down that hill. Or within community, and that's where this story comes from. It's one of my favorite stories. It's called Fire on the Mountain. Once long ago, there was a young man from Ethiopia, and times were hard, and like young men and young women have done since the dawn of time, they went seeking a better fortune. And he came to a land where the earth was good, and he went to work on a farm, and he did well at first. In fact, he was doing very well, and he even had a friend, another Ethiopian who was a retired merchant who lived in the town. But times grew hard. He was injured. He fell into debt, and he grew deeper and deeper and deeper into debt until at last he realized he would be in debt to that farmer forever. There seemed to be no way out, but there was one way out. The farmer had a wager that he always made to the workers who went into debt. He said, "You know, I will forgive your debt. I will give you land besides, if you can spend the night on that mountain over there without fire and without clothing. And perhaps if you survive, then you will get your freedom and your land." Well, many had gone up to the top of the mountain living, but none had come down alive. And so the young man agreed to that wager, and he went into the town, and he went to visit his friend the merchant. He said, and they had a cup of tea, of mint tea, and they sat, and the merchant asked him, "You don't often visit at this time of the day. What is troubling you?" And the young man told him about the wager. He told him about his debt, which the merchant already knew about. The merchant listened. And the young man finished his story saying, "And one way or another, tomorrow morning I will come down that mountain a free man." "Don't speak so soon of death," said the merchant. "I think I know what might help you. I'm going to give you two things. First of all, I'm going to go up a mountain a few miles away. I'll bring enough wood to keep a fire burning all that night. It will not warm you, but you will see its light. And perhaps that will get you through the night. And what's more, I will give you a second gift." "And what's that?" asked the young man. "I'm going to give you a story." And the merchant told a story of to the young man. And the young man was sitting enthralled. And just at the height of the excitement of the story, the merchant fell silent. He said, "When you come down from the mountain tomorrow morning, I will tell you the rest of the story." So the young man took his leave of the merchant. That evening, he was accompanied by two servants who went up that mountain, and when they reached the top, they stripped him of his clothing. And the sun fell and there was darkness, and the young man was left alone. And the wind blew, and the stars sparkled up above, mocking him with their light. But the one light that meant more than anything to him, was off in the distance. And he stared into the darkness until last there was a flicker of red and then yellow, and it was his friend who had kept his promise and remembered the last words that the merchant had given to him. "Remember this, as long as you see that light, there is someone who loves you and cares for you. Remember that." And all that night, although the young man suffered horribly, he remembered those words. He remembered the story that was not finished. And the next morning, when the sky turned from black to blue and the stars disappeared one by one, and the first sunlight that touched his skin was like a blessing from God. And the servants came up with his robe, expecting it to be a shroud, expecting once again to find a corpse. But they found him more dead than alive, but alive and free. And they brought him down to the farmer who made good on his promise. And that night, over a feast and cups of tea, the merchant told him the rest of that story. And that's the end of the story.
Thank you so much, Norman.
I just want to add one quick note, if I may.
Sure. Yeah.
Fire in the Mountain is a traditional Ethiopian story. And I actually added a part of a real life situation where a young 10-year-old girl was in a coma, and somebody read a book aloud to her, not thinking she was even listening. But that person's death watch ended before the story was finished being read. And the next person listened to Jean, I met her, by the way, and heard her speak from her coma. You didn't finish the story. I want to hear the rest of the story. And so that is my belief. Stories must not just be told, they must be heard. And that is power of story as well.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you. Dawn, how are we doing on time?
However you like. we can go at least another 10, 15 minutes, I think.
Okay, so the memory to story exercise, if you want to write it down, I will simply read very slowly from the Hebrew, okay? But from memory to story. Memory helps us preserve, story helps us make sense of it and transform. So the first thing we do is we choose a memory, okay? And it's really important for me to say, all answers are correct. So you think of a story and whatever comes to your mind, you think of a memory and whatever comes to mind is the right memory. It could be a formative moment or an event, okay, in your life or in your family's life or in your community's life. It could be a single image or a scent, okay, a smell that you remember or a taste. Could be a line from a poem that reminds you of something. So any memory. And very often when I invite people to think of a memory, it comes to mind immediately. So whatever comes to your mind, work with it, okay? And the first thing you do is you write down the memory, okay? Just write it down. Write everything that you remember. And then name the memory. Give the memory a name. And then the next thing you do is you write a story about this memory and emerging from this memory. And remember agency. So this is where we get to decide where we want to lead that memory. Where is it that we want to take the memory? And it's sort of a process of a quest, if you like, in search of the place or that place that we want to take the memory, okay? So this is the memory to story exercise. It's really very simple. It's just 2 or 3 steps. And whatever comes to mind are the right answers. Another great storytelling exercise, which I love, is the appreciative inquiry. Are you familiar with it? Those of you who are educators or community workers, etc., or doing evaluation may be familiar with the appreciative inquiry. The idea behind appreciative inquiry, we use it in evaluation or in documenting the story of a person or a family or a community or an organization. But the idea behind appreciative inquiry is appreciation, okay? Understanding that there are so many things in ourselves, in our families, in our communities that we can be proud of, okay? And the four appreciative inquiry questions are: what is the thing that you're most proud of, or things that you're most proud of in your life, in your personality? okay, in who you are. What are the values that guide you in your life? So what are the values, okay? What are the qualities that most characterize you, okay, from your life story? What are the qualities? Remember, resilience, resourcefulness, okay, loyalty, etc. And what are the challenges and obstacles that you have overcome in your life? And how did you emerge from these challenges or these trials and tribulations, if you like? Okay, so these are the 4 appreciative inquiry questions, and they're a great way for us to, each of us, to appreciate oneself. I often offer people to do this exercise in pairs, with one person first asking the question and the other person responding, and then switching roles. But so I don't know if it's a thing about women, or is it about people in general. We were taught as a child, I was taught that it was not me who should be singing my praises, right? Anyone else was taught, you know, Yehalelcha zar velo picha, or, you know, you're not supposed to be singing your own praises. But this isn't about singing our praises. This is about appreciating who we are, what we have endured, how we have overcome it. What is it in us that has helped us overcome what we had to endure? And the values and the qualities that are us, that are about us. I strongly recommend you try this. It's extremely empowering, and very often it is the beginning of a story, a personal story or a family story. Okay? Norman, will you post the address of your website? If you have a website, there was a question here.
Do you want a few more questions?
Sure, if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
There are many, many questions, but I'll ask about 3 because we are running out of time. Shane or Shane had a really good remark. I think oral stories also tell us something about bystander perspectives at a given time. And Jody asks, how does storytelling separate fact from fiction?
Great. Okay, so as I said earlier, stories are not fake news, okay? They do share information and they do share facts, but they do it in a very creative way, okay? Using imagination, okay? Because we know that there aren't really fairy godmothers or dragons that spit fire, etc. We know for a fact that they don't exist, but they exist in the sense that they symbolize something. So I'm not sure about separating facts from fiction. I think that it is about asking, sense making, okay? What does it mean? What is it telling us? What is it telling us about ourselves as people, about our lives, about the events, about, okay? So when I read a story, it's like, you know, when people watch a magician show, and we know that, you know, he's not really performing miracles and magic, but there are those who go, oh, wow, this is amazing. And then there's those who keep them, I know how he's doing that. Okay, that kills the magic, okay? So in story, it's really not about finding out what is true and what is fiction. I think it's really about, what is the story telling us? What is the story about, okay? I hope I understand the question about the bystander. I think that in stories, right, we have the protagonist, and then sometimes the protagonist is telling the story, and sometimes there is a narrator who's telling the story. And somehow the narrator is not as involved emotionally or otherwise, in telling the story. I, for example, am not that kind of storyteller. Okay, I find that it is always easier for me to tell my own stories and then invite others to tell their own. Okay, and as Norman said beautifully, it's not only about knowing how to share stories, but also how to hear them and listen to them. And so what I find very often about sharing stories, personal stories, human stories, is that it is not my mission or purpose in life to tell other people's stories for them. It is more about giving them a tool chest that they can fill with tools to share their own stories. And then I'm not a bystander. I'm more of a compassionate audience. I hope that answers the question. Okay, Dawn, I see we're beginning to lose people. It's always good. My mother always told me, leave when they still want you to stay.
Well, first of all, again, there are many compliments in the chat room. I'll definitely send you the transcript. Right now, I am going to open everybody's microphones so that they can say thank you personally. And we'll see you in the next event. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night from Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
Thank you, Hamutal. Thank you.
And my dear cousins, Bila, I hope I'm not missing anyone else that I know. It's so
very happy we found a way in. Now, bye.
Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank
Good
you.
night from South Africa.
Stay healthy and safe.
Yes, stay healthy and safe indeed.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know how to say thank you because it's been such an amazing webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.